Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the podcast. I want to talk about a term that we use a lot more now than we have in the past to talk about environmental injustice, about environmental racism. And I want to just bring out this term, see if it fits, and see if we should be using it more and more when we talk about environmental injustice. And that term is apartheid. It's apartheid. So I'm reading a lot more. I'm seeing a lot more advocates, a lot more activists use the word apartheid when they're talking about environmental injustice in their communities, in their cities, states, countries, even globally. People are using the word apartheid when they're talking about environmental injustice wherever they are. And so I thought it would be worthwhile to take a second to figure out if this term is appropriate, how we should be thinking about it, and if it even helps us move things forward in terms of talking about these issues in a way that's helpful and that actually moves the needle toward change. And so let's just spend a little bit of time talking about apartheid, if you don't mind. So if you don't know, apartheid, the term itself originated in South Africa, right? So the actual word apartheid is Afrikaans for apartness or separation. And the idea was in South Africa, there was a white minority of people and a black majority of people there. And the white minority wanted to maintain control and power over the country and to ensure that they set forth these policies of apartheid. They used the word, they came up with the word apartheid, and they described it as a policy to ensure that the white minority is protected and able to flourish by doing what they called separate development of racial groups. So they want to take all the different racial categories, separate them, and have them develop on their own, with their own resources, their own initiatives and policies. And so what ended up happening was that under this apartheid government, you had people who had to register under certain racial groups. And once you were identified as a certain racial group, you were put in a certain physical location in the country, and you were pretty much on your own in terms of developing your own society, your schools, your stuff around you, education, everything was on you if you were going to do it. And apartheid made laws that forced this to happen. It was by law. And so that's the big difference. People talk about discrimination, you talk about segregation, you talk about all these different forms of oppressing a people group. Apartheid is unique because it actually is done through the government, through the laws, through the policies. And that's what makes it apartheid versus just people being racist and discriminatory. People are going to be like that. They have been like that for ever since we've had people on earth. But apartheid says, not only do we want that to happen, we're going to ensure that the government legislates and enforces laws that ensure that there is segregation, that there is discrimination, that there is a situation where people are discriminated against legally. It's legal to do these things. And so in South Africa, this is what they did. They passed laws where you had to register by racial group. It's called the Population Registration Act. There are laws that physically place certain racial groups in certain parts of the country. It's called the Group Areas Act. And this is how they constructed society to ensure that the races, the racial groups were all separate and developing on their own. But as you would imagine, it isn't as though the South African government gave them all equal resources to develop on their own. Of course not. That defeats the whole purpose of separating them. The truth is, the white minority got the resources, got the best land, got all that they need to thrive and flourish, while the other racial groups did not. And that is why it's so insidious, this whole system of apartheid. And that's why people were raging against it back in the 70s and the 80s with protests, with boycotts and sanctions and all these other actions that people were taking across the world to try to force South Africa to rid themselves of this apartheid government, these apartheid policies, these apartheid ways of treating other people as less than. And so you may know the story. We finally had free and fair elections for everybody. I think in the 90s, Nelson Mandela became president and he brought the country together. Apartheid was no more. And I'm sure there's still discrimination now, but it's not legally sanctioned and enforced by the government. And so that's what apartheid is. And so when you hear the word, you might be thinking, well, if that's not happening, then we must not be dealing with apartheid. There must not be a situation where apartheid exists because that particular system of discrimination has been dismantled. And nobody's going to openly say that they want the government to do this kind of policy in their country. Who's going to say that? Who? I mean, some people on the fringe might long for the good old days of apartheid and where we were all separated. And I'm sure some people love to talk about it, but that's not going to happen now, is it? Is it? And so the United Nations stepped in, and to make sure that it was in law, they defined apartheid. They took that South African system and they said, here is how we're going to define apartheid so that if it ever happens anywhere else, we will be able to prosecute it as an international crime, a crime against humanity. That's what the UN did. And so here's the definition. The United Nations defines apartheid as a crime against humanity that involves the systematic oppression of one racial group by another through legalized racial segregation. That's their definition. So you systematically oppress, you discriminate, and you do it through legal means. And so they even go further. They say apartheid includes policies and practices that prevent racial groups from participating in a country's political, social, economic, and cultural life. This is what apartheid is. And so now it's not just, oh, did you do what South Africa did? It's, are you doing any of this at all in your country, in your context? If you are committing apartheid. And so that's the new definition that we can all look to when we look around to determine if we are in fact experiencing or witnessing apartheid occurring where we live. Now, you know, I live in the United States of America, and America has a nice history of these types of legalized forms of segregation, which people have consistently identified correctly as American apartheid. We've done it. We've done it here. Right? So back during the Great Depression, everybody was losing their jobs, losing their homes, losing everything. We had a big push, the New Deal from President Roosevelt to try to reestablish and reinvigorate our economy. And part of that New Deal was to get people houses, places to live. And the organizations that were responsible for handing out the home loans to people to purchase homes to live in engaged in apartheid with their policies. There's no way around it. We call it redlining, red line maps. They took maps of cities and they divided them up based on color. And the red areas were areas that they would not give loans to. You could not get a loan in those areas, and they prohibited Black Americans from getting loans in the other areas across the cities where they were. And so they were forced to live in these red-lined areas, forced to, by the policies of the corporations that handed out loans. That is what they did. And as a result, you have a systematic placement of a racial group in a particular part of a city or a state. And you guessed it, the services, the environment around those areas was much worse than anywhere else in that city. It's apartheid. Now, we had Jim Crow laws in America. In America, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there were laws that required segregation. You had to have segregated schools. Black children, colored kids go to one school, white kids go to another school. Which of those schools you think was better, was more equipped and funded to teach the children what they need to know? It was the white schools, not the colored ones. You had different parks, had to be segregated, different entities, restaurants, hotels, parks, libraries, bus stations, train stations, bathrooms, water fountains. Everything was segregated by law. You could not have a situation where white and black people were in the same place doing the same things together. It was against the law to do so. And so all of these policies, all of these laws serve to continually remind people of where you stood in society. This is who you are. This is where you belong. This is the levels, and you're on the bottom if you're African American, if you're black, if you're Hispanic, if you're anything other than white, you're on the bottom. That was what American apartheid did. And as a response, the civil rights movement pushed against it, fought for equal rights, equal application of the law, equal access to the things in society that we all need to survive, the schools, the parks, all these things that were segregated. There was a push and a fight to desegregate these things. And so there was hard work to dismantle American apartheid in the United States. It had to happen. We had great leaders, great organizations that fought to eliminate it. But now we're here. It's 2024. And those of us in the environmental justice world are talking about environmental apartheid. I was fine with saying environmental justice, right? We need to fight for environmental justice. That's what I kept saying. That's what the name of this podcast is called. That is what I thought we were all about, environmental justice. And people are telling me no. Environmental apartheid is what we are experiencing. That is what's happening. And so I had to look it up because I'll be honest, I thought that was a little bit strong. A little bit too, hey, apartheid? I don't know if that is appropriate. Are you going too far with that type of phrasing? It just feels like it's a little much, you know? Fighting for justice, for rights, for equality, equity. I'm fine with these terms. It's perfectly fine. You start talking about apartheid? What it did during Jim Crow? What happened in South Africa? What's happening in other parts of the world today as people are being actively subjugated and, in some cases, killed because of who they are? Is that what we're talking about? I had to look it up. And so I spent some time on the Google looking up this term environmental apartheid because I said, you know what? I don't want to be missing it if that's what's really happening. And so this is what I learned. So the phrase environmental apartheid, the first time I saw it used was in a journal article written by these researchers, Valerie Stoll, Michael Bell, Mpuelelo Nkwadi, and their article was entitled Environmental Apartheid, Eco Health and Rural Marginalization in South Africa. And they published this in 2016 in the Journal of Rural Studies. And what's interesting is that they chronicle in South Africa during apartheid the ways in which the environment itself was separated and how it was used to the benefit of the white minority over the black majority. And so what they talked about in the article was how the black majority in South Africa were relegated by law to certain parts of the country where the land is not as good and prosperous and fertile, and the infrastructure is poor and not maintained well, and they were pushed to those parts of the country to live in. And then, while they lived there, there was no investment in their communities, no running water, no electricity. This is back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. No sanitation, no real roads, no paved roads. Everything was set up so that they couldn't actually develop and build up the land that they were forced to stay on. And so I said, that is exactly what environmental apartheid would look like. Using the law and taking the environment and what it offers you and ensuring that only a certain group can enjoy what comes from it. That's a classic. That has to be what it is. And so I keep looking, I keep researching, and I come across other terms that make complete sense when you think about what is actually happening on the ground versus how we want to talk about it. So I'll be honest, when people talk about climate change, it makes me want to scream because you're missing the true impact and the disproportionate impact that climate change has on certain individuals. And so for a while, it was climate change. We've shifted now to climate justice. We want climate justice. But now there's a word called a climate apartheid. Oh, and so I looked it up. And this is what the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty and Human Rights says, because he coined the term climate apartheid. He came up with it. And obviously, if you're working on global poverty and human rights, you know more about this stuff than I do. So I'm going to listen to what he has to say and how he views the situation on the ground when it comes to the climate issues that we keep screaming about. And so this is what he says. He says climate apartheid is where the rich pay to escape heat and hunger caused by the escalating climate crisis while the rest of the world suffers. And he says that the impacts of global heat, climate change, are going to undermine not just basic rights to life, water, and food, but he says also to democracy and the rule of law, because once these basic rights are no longer available, you're going to have to change the way you do government and business to maintain that structure and to maintain those disparities. And so you're going to be creating, if you haven't already, an apartheid system where certain people get the water, they get the food, they get the housing, they get what they need, they get protection and relief from the climate impacts while the rest don't. Climate apartheid is a real thing. And so we have to, look, I'm coming around. We got to use these terms. Environmental apartheid, climate apartheid. We have to call it what it is, especially when you see the response to the ways in which the climate is changing. Look, so we know that the climate crisis is fueled by rich, developed countries polluting on a massive scale, and those impacts occurring disproportionately to those who have no or very little impact on the climate as a whole. We know that for a fact. But what we're also starting to learn is that as those impacts expand globally and begin to impact these developed countries, the United States being one of them, well, the people with the resources are going to find their way out. They're going to find a way to mitigate those impacts on themselves. They're going to figure out how they can avoid the worst of it, while the rest of us can't, because we don't have those resources, those opportunities to avoid or at least to protect ourselves from the impacts. You don't have it. And so now, once the rich nations, the rich corporations, the individuals with all the wealth begin to insulate themselves from impacts that they're primarily responsible for, and they begin to institute a system and policies that allow them to insulate themselves from the impacts that they're responsible for, you have an apartheid system. It's plain and simple. You have climate apartheid. And that's what this UN special rapporteur is saying. And I agree with them 100%. It's climate apartheid. There's another one. Food apartheid. Food apartheid. This was coined by food activists back in the 80s who used the term to describe how there are structural inequalities that limit access to healthy food for low-income communities and communities of color. It's not a coincidence. That's what she's saying. It's not a coincidence that some neighborhoods have multiple grocery stores, multiple supermarkets, fresh food markets, farmers markets, and some barely even have a dollar store or a pharmacy to go to or a corner store to get their food. It's not a coincidence. It is by design. It is deliberately done to ensure that that is the case. And I know it is. I know it is because I, like so many other people, make an effort to try to find the communities that have these stores and this access available. Why would I do that? Why would I drive around when I'm trying to buy a home and looking for the nicest grocery stores and the best roads? Because I know there's a difference. I know there's a difference. I know that difference is not an accident. I want to go where it is and try to get a place where I have the access that I need to feed myself and my family. I'm very, very, very fortunate in that regard that I can do that I have the ability to choose where to live based on the access of the food and schools and anything else that I believe is important to me and my family. Everybody can't do that, and you shouldn't have to do that, because healthy food should be available to everyone, no matter who you are, no matter where you are. And at the very least, you should be able, as a community, to determine what types of food are available to you. You shouldn't be subject to structural, political, ideological considerations of others to determine if you have a grocery store near you. And so the fact that our zoning laws, our zoning practices, the fact that we have a system where profit and revenue are the only ways that we determine what is or isn't worth investing in, we have contributed to this system of food apartheid. I'll give you an example. I live in South Carolina. I am a professor at the University of South Carolina, big university, right in the capital city. And I have to tell you, there is no struggle to find healthy food, nice restaurants, places to go, spend time with students, with faculty. It's easy when you work and live around the University of South Carolina. It's in Columbia, South Carolina. It's the capital. Now, I also teach at Benedict College. Benedict College is an historically Black college, also in Columbia, literally a mile and a half away from the main University of South Carolina campus. You can drive there in 5 minutes. You'll be from USC to Benedict College. It's real simple drive. But I promise you this, if you want to buy groceries and you go to Benedict College as a student, you will not find what you need unless you drive close to the University of South Carolina. That's what you have to do. There's nothing around Benedict College worth eating. Nothing. Because all of those restaurants, all those grocery stores, all those supermarkets are concentrated around the University of South Carolina. Now you could say, well, it's a bigger school, more students, more opportunities to make money, more customers that are available, and that's fine. But I'm working on a study right now to look at all the USC system schools across the state. There's 8 of them. Some of them are in nice urban areas. Some of them are rural. We'll see what the differences are. And the HBCUs in South Carolina. There's 8 of them. Some of them are in rural areas. Some are in urban areas. And I promise you this, when those findings come out, you will know that there is a big difference between the kinds of food that's available around the HBCUs, the Black colleges and universities, and what's around the University of South Carolina schools, the predominantly white universities. And the reason is clearly food apartheid. It's not a coincidence. It's not just a product of the system of going to school at different universities. It's none of that. It is systematic, it is deliberate, and it's institutional. That is what it is. And so for me, food apartheid, it's an easy sell for me because I see it. I see it every day. Food apartheid is a real thing. And unless we actually do something about it, we'll continue to have a situation where, depending on the type of school you go to, the type of community you live in, your food options will be determined for you. And if you are Black, brown, indigenous, you will have fewer options if you have any at all, and you will have more of the worst types of foods available to you because of food apartheid. That is what we're talking about. So, we got environmental apartheid, we have climate apartheid, we have food apartheid, and my last one for today, infrastructure apartheid. Infrastructure apartheid. Now, this apartheid is the systematic denial of basic infrastructure needs based on race and class. This term, infrastructure apartheid, was coined by Dr. Maya Carrasquillo at the University of California, Berkeley. Just as a side note, she is a phenomenal environmental engineering researcher. She's probably the first person that I realized did environmental justice work as an engineering professor. Usually they're public health professors or they're sociology professors or they're epidemiologists. She is an environmental engineering professor doing environmental justice. I went to her conference last month. Phenomenal conference. I had my little presentation. I sat in the audience, watched all the other ones, blown away. Amazing work. It was called the We Rise Summit. We Rise is an acronym for Working to Eradicate Racism in Science and Engineering. That was the summit. Great summit. If you can go next year, you should definitely go to it. It's at UC Berkeley. It was phenomenal. So her research, her lab looks at infrastructure apartheid, and she evaluates the idea that there are communities and there are certain neighborhoods who lack the necessary infrastructure to live in those areas. Meanwhile, other parts have more than enough. Plenty of infrastructure spending, infrastructure repairs, improvements, expansions, whatever they need to continue to grow and flourish, they get it. Other communities don't even have the basic maintenance covered on their infrastructure. It's apartheid. It's systematic. It is institutional. The people who make the decisions, city councils, county councils, the mayor's office, the governor's office, how money is spent, is systematically designed to privilege certain communities over others. We all know it. Now we have a name for it. Infrastructure apartheid. We can call it that because that's what it is. You know, there have been studies that show how much worse, for instance, that flooding is in certain communities of color. Why would that be an issue? Because the infrastructure isn't designed to handle the storms and the weather that comes to that neighborhood. To get real technical, the stormwater system has certain piping under it and drainage systems that allow for water to flow through as it rains to keep places from flooding. If you have adequately sized piping under there and well-designed drains, you won't flood. You won't. That water drains and it goes out to a river, to a lake, to the ocean if you're on the coast, and you're not flooding. But if you don't have that, you will flood. You will. Or if it's not maintained, or it's clogged up, or it's covered up, or it's not clear so the water can go through, it's going to flood. It's a problem. And so there's a lot of research that looks at how stormwater infrastructure is vastly different based on the community. It's a big problem. It's a big problem. What about water, wastewater systems? I mean, we want clean water to come in. We want our wastewater to go out. We don't want it to flow in the streets. We don't want our water lines to be breaking and water flowing in the streets. And so we maintain our infrastructure to prevent that from happening. However, in certain communities, those water lines, those sewer lines are older than those communities. And they're poorly maintained, if they're maintained at all. And so you get dirty water. You get sanitary sewer overflows when it rains because the sewer piping is not adequate. And this is all a part of what Dr. Carrasquillo calls infrastructure apartheid. That is what it is. And so when we're in the environmental justice world and we're talking about inequities, we're talking about injustice, we're talking about inequality, all the things that go into the reasons why certain communities have different experiences with climate change, with their infrastructure, with their food systems, the reasons that that happens. I used to say it's injustice, right? We're not applying the laws equally across these neighborhoods. That's what injustice means. You have the law in place and it was meant to be applied to everyone, but you're not applying the law equally. It's an injustice. But now we know that it goes beyond that because there are people in power who are putting in place policies that bring about these inequities, that bring about these unequal ways of protecting the environment, protecting people who live in certain areas. Is being done deliberately, and that's what makes it apartheid. So I don't have any problem saying that we, all across the world, in America, wherever you are probably seeing some form of environmental apartheid where you live. It might be climate apartheid, it might be food apartheid, it might be infrastructure apartheid. It's something. Because this is unacceptable. and to know that there are people in power who actually have the ability to correct injustice. But instead of doing so, they actually exacerbate it by passing laws and allowing for things to happen that disadvantage different communities. Come on, man, that's what you're doing. That's what it is. And for anyone listening, don't be afraid to call it out. It's apartheid. Don't be shouted down by someone saying, oh, that's what happened in South Africa. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not applicable here. Yes, it is. If you're setting up a system where things are different based on race, based on class, based on religion, based on these other characteristics, you are engaging in the development and the upholding of an apartheid system. That's what you're doing. That's what I would be doing if I were to be involved with that. That's what it is. When you're sitting on that council meeting and you know that that Black neighborhood has already had 5 different chemical plants built in it, and the 6th one comes around for approval, and you say, yes, they can build there, you are contributing to the apartheid that is occurring in that neighborhood. Yes, you are. When it's time to distribute infrastructure spending and money from the government to improve the bridges, the roads, the water systems, the piping, and you choose to concentrate that money in wealthy, affluent neighborhoods, while you've seen the reports, you know there's certain communities that need that money just to survive, just to have water that's clean, just to have a road that won't destroy their car when they drive on it to go to work every day because they have to work to make a living. You are engaging in apartheid. You just are. And look, it might sound harsh. I thought it was at the beginning. I was kind of unsure about it. I don't have a problem now because that's what you're doing. That's what it is. And I'm thankful that there are researchers, there are people who are fighting against it, who are bringing it to light, who are actually doing the work to inform us of these different systems of apartheid that exist in the environmental justice space. This is what's happening. And we cannot turn our eyes away. We can't turn our backs. We can't pretend like this isn't what it is. This is what's actually happening. It is apartheid. And we have to call it out, make sure people are aware of it, and make sure that we do whatever we can do to fight against it. Because I'm not going to sit around and allow for these apartheid systems to reign and to rule over all of these communities who are just trying to survive, just trying to eat, just trying to make it from day to day. Not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. In my research group, which I don't have one yet, I'm trying to build one, we're going to engage in the same kind of work. We want to expose these types of inequities and call them what they are directly. We want to make sure that when we fight for justice, we're not blind to the reasons why the injustices are occurring, the reasons why they exist. We can't just act as though they're just happenstance and we're just doing our best to make things equal. We have to actually engage the systems that are perpetuating these inequities, that are baking these inequities into the fabric of our societies. We have to do that. We have to know that this is the reason why we see what we see. Not just that we see it, not just that it's concerning to us, but there's a reason why it's happening. And in many cases, the reason is apartheid. The reason is that there is a rich, white majority or minority of people who do not believe that certain communities are valued enough, worthy enough, important enough to provide basic services, basic rights to. And so They've instituted this system of apartheid to enshrine those disparities. And we can't stand for it. We can't do it. And so I hope that all of you listening will consider not just the inequities, not just the injustices, but consider why they are what they are and why they've persisted for so long. Just think about it. And my guess is, as you think about it, you'll come to the same word that I came to, that all these advocates came to, that the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty and Human Rights came to, and that word is apartheid. Apartheid. And that's our show. Thanks for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. I'll see you next time.